Somewhere right now, in the dark or the quiet of wherever you are, you're about to step into the longest story ever told. Not a story written in books, because books didn't exist yet. Not recorded in temples or carved into stone tablets, because those came later, much later. This is the story that lives in your bones, in the shape of your hands, in the wiring of your brain. It's the story of what humans actually did for the vast majority of the time we've been human. Here's a number that tends to rearrange something in the back of your mind. Modern humans, people essentially identical to you and me, have existed for somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years. Agriculture, the thing we usually point to as the beginning of civilization, appeared roughly 12,000 years ago, which means that for somewhere around 150,000 years, possibly longer, fully modern human beings were alive on this planet, thinking, feeling, raising children, telling stories, falling in love, watching stars, and doing it all without a single city, a single farm, a single written word. That enormous stretch of time is what this video is about. And before we go any further, it's worth being honest about something. What we actually know about those 150,000 years is fragmentary in ways that are genuinely humbling. Archaeology can tell us an enormous amount, but only when people left something behind that survived. Stone tools survive. Bones sometimes survive. Charcoal from ancient fires survives. But the things that made up most of daily life, wooden shelters, woven baskets, songs, conversations, the names people called each other, the stories they told their children, those are gone. Completely and utterly gone. So everything you're about to hear is built from a combination of physical evidence, genetic analysis, and careful inference. When the evidence is strong, I'll say so. When we're looking at possibilities and educated guesses, I'll say that too. Because the honest version of this story is actually more interesting than a confident one. Genetics has become one of the most powerful tools we have for reading the deep past. As you may have heard in the introduction to this channel, DNA carries a kind of molecular memory, a record of who survived, who reproduced, where populations moved, and when catastrophes nearly ended everything. Stone tools and fossils tell us what people made and what they looked like. DNA tells us something closer to what they went through. And together, the picture that emerges is both stranger and more beautiful than most of us were taught. There are a few mysteries in particular that this video is going to keep circling back to, because they're the ones that really get under your skin. The question of the first art, not just cave paintings in France and Spain, which are already breathtaking, but evidence suggesting that human beings were making symbolic marks and using pigment far earlier than we once thought, possibly 100,000 years ago or more. The question of early long-distance trade, or something that looked very much like it, with materials showing up hundreds of miles from where they originated in an era when there were no roads, no markets, no money. And the question of early ritual, evidence that people were doing something with their dead, with ochre, with shells, with deliberate arrangement, that points toward an inner life we can barely glimpse but can't quite dismiss. These aren't fully solved puzzles. They're doorways into a past that keeps surprising us, and we'll walk through each of them as we go. But for now, I want to invite you to do something a little different. Instead of thinking about prehistory as a timeline full of dates and categories, I want you to imagine a single ordinary day. Not a dramatic day. Not the day someone painted a mammoth on a cave wall or crossed a land bridge into a new continent. Just a Tuesday. Or whatever passed for a Tuesday. You wake up before dawn. The fire from the night before is mostly ash. Someone is already stirring it back to life. The light is grey and soft. Somewhere close, children are still sleeping in a pile of warmth. The day ahead involves finding food, maintaining relationships, watching the sky, and probably doing a dozen small-skilled things with your hands that took years to learn. By nightfall, you will have walked several miles, solved at least a few problems, laughed at something, and felt the particular comfort of sitting close to other human beings in the dark. That day, repeated across thousands of generations, is what built us. And by the end of this video, I think it will feel less distant than you expect. Before we go further, if you're watching on YouTube and you want a version without any ads and without any background music, just a voice in the dark, this video is on Spotify as well. Following the channel there is completely free and it directly supports the work of making these. There's a link in the description. It genuinely makes a difference. And while you're down there, I want to know something. Where in the world are you right now, and what time is it? Because one of the things I genuinely love about this channel is the comment section, which turns into something that feels a little like those ancient bands sitting around a fire together. Berlin at 3 a.m. Mumbai just after sunrise. Someone in New Zealand on their lunch break. Someone in Canada who can't sleep again. Drop a comment, tell me where you are, I read them. Now, the world you're about to travel back into is not the world you know. The continents are in almost the same positions, but the coastlines are different. The climate is different. And the humans walking across the landscape are using every single thing they have just to make it through. No safety net, no grocery stores, no hospitals, no guarantee of anything. And yet, from that precarious existence, something extraordinary was being built, slowly, invisibly, over tens of thousands of years. Something that eventually led, against all reasonable probability, to you, lying somewhere comfortable, listening to a story about your own impossibly deep past. Let's begin at the very beginning of what we can see. A world of shifting climates and vanishing coastlines, where the ground itself was never quite the same from one generation to the next. To understand what your ancestors were doing for those lost 150,000 years, you have to start with the stage they were standing on. And the stage was not stable, not even close. We live in a relatively unusual moment. The last 10 or 12,000 years have been, by the standards of deep time, a long calm. Not perfectly calm, but calm enough that you can build a city next to a river and expect the river to still be there in the same place when your grandchildren are old. The Pleistocene, the era that covers most of human evolution, was different. It was a world that kept shifting its rules. People sometimes hear Ice Age and imagine one endless winter, a planet locked in snow. But the Ice Ages were more like a pulse. Cold phases, when great ice sheets expanded across the north and the world dried out in many places. Then warmer interludes, when the ice pulled back, rains returned to some regions, forests spread, lakes refilled. And these swings didn't happen smoothly. They could be abrupt. In some cases, within a few generations, landscapes could transform in ways that would feel almost supernatural if you didn't know the physics behind it. And crucially, those global temperature changes didn't translate into one simple, uniform experience everywhere. While northern Europe was grinding under glaciers, parts of Africa might be going through a period of expanded grasslands and larger lakes, or the opposite. One region could become a corridor of life while another, not so far away, turned into a barrier. So if you're trying to picture daily human existence in this world, don't picture a single map. Picture a map that keeps being redrawn. Rivers shifting, deserts breathing outward and then retreating, coastlines sliding back and forth like a slow tide that takes thousands of years to rise and fall. And sea level is one of the most important pieces of this, because sea level isn't just about beaches. Sea level decides how big the world is. During colder phases, a lot of the planet's water is locked up as ice. Not just mountain glaciers, but continental-scale ice sheets. When that happens, sea level drops, sometimes by tens of meters, sometimes by over 100. That sounds like a number on a chart until you realize what it means on the ground. Whole stretches of continental shelf that are underwater today would have been dry land. New plains appear, new river mouths form far out where waves now break. Islands become peninsulas. Shallow seas turn into wide, walkable basins. Then the world warms again. Ice melts. Sea level rises. Those same plains drown. River valleys become estuaries. Coasts move inland. And every group of humans living near the ocean has to respond, because the edge of the world, the place where land turns to water and food concentrates, has just shifted, sometimes by miles, sometimes by tens of miles. What's almost painful to think about is how much evidence we've lost because of this. When sea levels rose after the last glacial period, they didn't just flood empty land, they flooded some of the best human habitat on Earth. Coastlines are rich. They offer shellfish, fish, seabirds, sea mammals, salt, seaweed, driftwood, and a kind of predictable abundance that inland environments often can't match. So it's entirely possible that for tens of thousands of years, some human groups were living along coasts, building traditions and routines around tidal rhythms, returning to the same coves and inlets, teaching their children where the shell beds were and when the fish ran. And then, later, the sea rose and erased the evidence. Their campsites are underwater now. Their hearths, their tools, their discarded shells, gone beneath sediment and waves. This is one reason the deep past can feel so fragmentary. It isn't only that people didn't write things down, it's that the planet itself has been sweeping the floor. And it wasn't just the oceans. Inland, water was playing the same game. In the Pleistocene, rivers and lakes were not permanent fixtures the way we like to imagine them. They expanded and shrank as rainfall patterns shifted. Some lakes became enormous during humid phases, then retreated or vanished during dry periods. Basins that are deserts today sometimes held water long enough to support grasslands, game animals and human travel routes. Then the climate swung again, and those same basins became traps, vast empty stretches where a travelling group could die if they miscalculated. This is where the idea of green corridors comes in. Not corridors built by anyone, not roads, more like temporary windows in the landscape. When monsoon systems strengthened, when rains reached farther north, parts of the Sahara that we think of as an absolute wall could become something else. Not a paradise, not a garden, but a mosaic. Patches of savanna, chains of lakes, seasonal rivers, wetlands full of birds and edible plants, herds moving through. Under those conditions, what looks like an impassable desert on a modern map becomes a pathway. And when the rains weakened again, that pathway closed. The lakes shrank. Rivers broke into isolated pools. Vegetation retreated. The same route that once carried animals and people became a barrier of sand and heat and thirst. Similar things happened in Eurasia. Steppe zones expanded and contracted. Forest belts shifted north and south. Mountain passes opened in some periods and became ice-choked in others. A river valley could be a lifeline for thousands of years and then, through a change in climate or sedimentation, become less reliable, forcing people to change their whole rhythm of movement. If you were alive in that world, you wouldn't have thought of it as climate change. You would have thought of it as the personality of the land, the way some years were generous and some were cruel, the way elders remembered waterholes that the young had never seen, the way certain places were spoken of with a kind of respect, because they could save you and they could also betray you. And the truth is, we can see traces of these swings. Not perfectly, not everywhere, but enough to know the pattern was real. Scientists read this ancient world through what amount to natural archives, pollen cores, for example. In lakes and bogs, year after year, plants release pollen that settles and becomes layered in sediment. Drill down through those layers and you can find a record of changing vegetation. More grass pollen in one period, more tree pollen in another. It's like finding the landscape's diary, written in grains so small you can barely see them. There are isotopes too, tiny chemical signatures that shift depending on temperature and rainfall. oxygen isotopes in ice cores, in cave deposits called speleothems, in shells and lake sediments, each one a clue about past climates. Lake sediments can show when a lake was deep and stable, when it became salty and shallow, when it dried out and returned. Glacial records, the scars and deposits left by advancing and retreating ice, tell you when the cold phases peaked and when the world warmed again. None of these sources gives you a full-colour movie. They give you pieces, graphs with uncertainties, local records that don't always line up neatly with each other because local conditions matter. And that's the part that's worth emphasising, because it keeps us honest. The Pleistocene wasn't a single global story playing out the same way everywhere. It was 1,000 regional stories braided together. One valley could stay relatively stable while the plateau nearby became drier. One coastline could become richer as sea level fell and new tidal flats formed, while another coastline became harsher as currents changed and storms intensified. Even in the same general climate phase, two groups separated by a few hundred miles might have lived in completely different worlds. So when we talk about humans adapting, we're not talking about one strategy that everyone used. We're talking about a toolbox, a set of choices that had to be made again and again. When do you roam and when do you stay? Mobility in this world wasn't just wandering. It was planning. It was memory. It was social knowledge. If rainfall was reliable and local resources were abundant, it might make sense to stay in a region longer, to learn it deeply, to return to the same sheltering rock overhangs, to know which plants ripen first after the rains, where the game tends to cross a river, which spots hold water late into the dry season. But when conditions deteriorated, staying could become deadly. Grasslands turn to scrub, herds move away, springs fail, and then the smartest move isn't heroism, it's leaving, following water, following animals, following the faint green thread of life across an otherwise hostile landscape. And there's another layer to this. Humans don't just move because of ecology. They move because of other humans. If a corridor opens, if the Sahara greens, if the Levant becomes wetter, if a coastal shelf turns into a new rich plain, populations can expand into it. But expansion creates contact. Contact creates competition sometimes, and exchange other times. And when the corridor closes again, groups can become isolated, trapped on one side of a desert or mountain belt that has grown more difficult to cross. Isolation changes things over time. Languages drift. Tool traditions diverge. Genes diverge. And then the corridor opens again, and people meet once more. Not as strangers exactly, but as distant cousins who've been living different histories. This opening and closing of pathways may be one of the deep rhythms behind human diversity, not just biologically but culturally. It's not hard to imagine knowledge travelling in bursts during favourable periods when routes are passable, then becoming local and specialised during harsh phases when movement is risky. So when you picture your ancestors in this section of the story, don't picture them as stuck in one place, or endlessly migrating like they have nowhere to be. Picture them as people reading a world that keeps changing, using that reading to make decisions that were both practical and emotional. Because leaving isn't just a logistical choice. It means abandoning familiar places, graves, old camps, favourite trees. It means walking into uncertainty with children who can't walk as fast, with elders who can't walk as far, with everything you own carried on your back. And staying, too, is an emotional choice. Staying means betting that the rains will return, that the herd will come back, that the river will rise again. It means holding on. A lot of what we call prehistory is really the record of these bets. And the reason we have to talk about uncertainty again and again is that even with all our clever methods, we often can't reconstruct the exact conditions of a specific place at a specific time. We can say a region was generally drier. We can say grasslands expanded. We can say sea levels were lower. But what did it feel like in one particular valley where one particular band lived? Was there a spring that never dried? Was there a grove of fruiting trees that changed everything? Did a single storm refill a basin and keep it alive for another decade? Those details can decide whether people thrive or die, and they rarely fossilize. So instead of a single definitive narrative, what we have is a set of constraints and possibilities. A world that is cold, then warm, then cold again. A world where coasts appear and disappear, where green corridors open and close, and within that world humans doing what humans do best, adapting, improvising, remembering, sharing information, and making the most of whatever the land offers. Because here's the thing, in a stable world you can specialize. You can build your life around predictability. In an unstable world, adaptability becomes the most precious skill there is. And that pressure, this constant demand to adjust, to learn new routes, to exploit new foods, to survive sudden downturns, didn't just shape where humans lived. It shaped what humans became. The bodies and minds that emerge out of this shifting Pleistocene stage are not accidents. They are in part answers to it. And that takes us to the next question. If the world kept changing, what had to change inside the human animal to keep up? If you walked into Africa 200,000 or 300,000 years ago, you wouldn't immediately recognize us in the faces you saw. You'd see people, clearly human, but the picture wouldn't be as simple as one sudden appearance of modern Homo sapiens, fully formed and ready for history. Instead, what you'd see is a mosaic. Different regions held different kinds of humans, some with combinations of traits that look more archaic to us, some that look surprisingly modern, and many that are a blend. Taller, shorter, heavier boned, lighter boned. Skulls with subtly different shapes. Faces a little broader here, a little more delicate there. Evolution in this period doesn't draw a clean line and say, before this date, not us, after this date, us. It works more like a patchwork quilt sewn over time in different places out of slightly different pieces. When we talk about Homo sapiens emerging in Africa, that's the world we're talking about. A continent-sized laboratory where populations were sometimes connected, sometimes separated by deserts or forests or distance, exchanging genes and ideas when corridors opened, drifting apart when conditions closed them off again. Some of these groups carried traits we'd call modern in their skulls and skeletons. Others carried behaviours we'd recognise in ourselves, making complex tools, moving over long distances, perhaps decorating objects or themselves. Put all of those strands together over tens of thousands of years, and you get something like the first true version of us. But it doesn't happen with a single birth or a single invention. It happens as a pattern that gradually becomes clearer while the climate keeps shifting around it. Part of that pattern is the body. The classic Homo sapiens body is built for a particular kind of life. Not sprinting like a cheetah, not towering like a giant ape, but doing something much less dramatic and much more important in the long run. Steady, efficient movement across rough ground, day after day. Compared to earlier humans, our skeletons are generally more gracile, finer boned, but that doesn't mean fragile. The ankle, knee and hip joints are shaped to handle long periods of walking and running. The arch of the foot works like a spring. The long tendons in the legs and feet store and release energy with every step, making endurance travel less costly. Our big gluteal muscles and the structure of the pelvis help keep us stable while we run, so our upper bodies don't pitch wildly from side to side. There are other quiet adaptations as well. A whole system of sweat glands and relatively little body hair make us unusually good at dumping heat compared to many mammals. Our breathing and circulatory systems can support long periods of moderate exertion, Taken together, these traits don't turn us into super athletes in any obvious way, but they make it possible for small groups to cover distance, to follow herds, to search widely for water and edible plants without collapsing. It's tempting to tell heroic stories here. People running antelopes to exhaustion over endless plains, epic chases under the noon sun. Maybe that happened sometimes, maybe in some places with some groups. But the safer picture, the one that fits what we know, is more modest. People who could keep going, who could leave a drying valley and make it to the next one, who could loop out from camp on foraging trips that were measured in hours or days, not minutes. Bodies that were good at enough endurance, not mythical extremes. Those bodies were carrying something else that mattered even more, a mind increasingly specialised for living in a world that wouldn't sit still. We can't open a Pleistocene skull and read thoughts from the bone, but we can infer some of what those brains were doing from the traces of behaviour they left behind. When you see stones napped in a consistent style across a wide region, that's not just hands at work, that's planning and shared tradition. When you see tools transported long distances from their original rock sources, that suggests people understood landscapes well enough to remember where rare materials were and cared enough to carry them home. Planning like that doesn't happen in isolation. It implies thinking ahead, not just what do I need now, but what will I need at the next camp? What will my children need? It implies teaching, because standardized techniques don't arise fresh in every generation. They're passed on. An adult shows a youngster how to strike stone at the right angle, how to trim a spear point, how to prepare a plant so it nourishes instead of poisons. The youngster tries, fails, tries again, and those small corrections, not like that, like this, are a form of quiet, everyday education. Around shared fires, in whatever languages they were speaking, people must have been trading information, where they'd seen animals last season, which hollow trees housed bees, which strangers were friendly and which were dangerous. Cooperation stops being optional when the land is unpredictable. One person might remember the old waterhole, another might know how to read the sky for approaching storms, a third might be especially good at calming an argument before it tears the band apart. None of this shows up directly in the fossils, which is why we have to be careful. Bones and genes and stone tools are clues, not full biographies. On the one hand, the fossils give us shapes, skulls from places like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, Omo Kibish, and Herto in Ethiopia, and other sites across Africa that combine older and newer features in different mixes, brow ridges softening, faces becoming a bit flatter, brain cases becoming more globular. Not all at once, not in one single line, but as a scattered record of populations gradually converging on what we'd recognise as Homo sapiens anatomy. On the other hand, genetics gives us patterns of relationship. DNA extracted from living people, and, in a few lucky cases from ancient bones, suggests that our species has deep roots in Africa, with multiple regions contributing to the final picture. It also shows that the story wasn't isolated. There were genes from other human groups flowing into our lineage, and our genes flowing into theirs, in different times and places. Put together, fossils and genetics tell us that becoming human was not a lonely process. We shared the continent, and later the wider old world, with other humans, some like us, some not quite like us, some belonging to lineages, like the so-called archaic Africans, that we're only beginning to understand. Sometimes we probably competed with them. Sometimes we likely traded or shared mates or copied each other's tricks. Sometimes we just passed at a distance, aware of each other but keeping to separate territories. So when we ask, when did modern behaviour appear? We're probably asking the wrong kind of question. There's little sign of a single overnight revolution where minds suddenly switched on and culture burst into full bloom everywhere at once. Instead, the evidence looks more like pulses. In one period, In one region, you might see an uptick in symbolic behaviour. Pieces of ochre that look as if they were engraved, beads made from shells, pigments collected from far away. Then, perhaps separated in space or time, another pulse. New hunting techniques, new ways of organising camp, new forms of long-distance exchange. These innovations appear, spread for a while, sometimes disappear from the record, sometimes resurface in altered form somewhere else. It's as if different parts of the human network lit up at different moments, trying new ways of thinking and living, some of which stuck and became part of the shared toolkit, and some of which faded out when conditions changed. By the time our ancestors began expanding seriously out of Africa, they carried bodies that could move through a restless world and minds that could imagine more than what was right in front of them. But those capacities had been assembled piece by piece, in many places, many times. Not as a single leap into modernity, but as a long series of quiet adjustments. Those bodies and minds would now turn to the next challenge, not just surviving in a shifting landscape, but reshaping it with skill. The tools in their hands were about to become more than simple stones. For a long stretch of our deep past, stone was the main thing that survived well enough for us to find. Wood rots, leather crumbles, fibres and glues and bindings dissolve, but the stones your ancestors struck open, shaped, used, resharpened and finally discarded, those remain. To an archaeologist, those aren't just rocks. They're frozen traces of decisions. Every flake that flew off a core did so because someone chose where to hit, how hard, and from what angle. When those choices repeat in the same way at dozens of sites, across hundreds of miles, over thousands of years, something important is hiding in that pattern. It means someone taught someone else how to do it. It means a style of making things became a habit, then a tradition. In the Middle Stone Age in Africa, and the Middle Paleolithic in Europe and Western Asia, you start to see those traditions getting more and more deliberate. Earlier, humans had already invented fine tools, hand axes shaped on both sides, sharp flakes struck from cores, but the basic idea had been around for more than 1 million years with relatively slow change. Then, gradually, the way people thought about stone began to shift. Instead of just knocking useful pieces off a rock until it looked like the right shape, knappers began to prepare the stone before they took the main flakes. They would study the raw block, shape it into a particular geometry, and only then deliver a few carefully placed blows to remove a series of usable pieces. Archaeologists call this prepared core technology. You might hear names like Levallois for certain versions of it. The label doesn't matter as much as what it implies. Prepared core methods mean someone could imagine the tool they wanted before it existed, and then rearrange the stone to make that future shape possible. It's a kind of 3D planning, thinking not just about the flake you're taking now, but about the ones you'll take 3 or 4 steps from now. It's choreography, embedded in rock. Done well, these techniques produce standardized flakes, pieces with fairly predictable size, thickness and edge shape. If you know that every flake you remove will be more or less the same, you can start designing tasks around them. This one for cutting meat, that one for scraping hides, another shaped into a point to go at the end of a spear. Those points become especially important in this period. You see them again and again. Thin, elongated flakes, retouched along their edges into tidy symmetrical tips. Some are clearly made to be handheld knives or perforators. Others are more likely meant to be mounted on something else, transforming a simple sharp stone into the business end of a larger tool. That's where another quiet revolution appears: composite technology. A composite tool is a combination of parts. Stone is just one piece of the puzzle. The others, wooden shafts, fibre bindings, plant resins, sinews, rarely survive for us to find, but the stones carry clues. Microscopic wear along the base of a point, polish and striations at angles that don't match cutting, traces of plant resin still clinging in tiny patches. All of these suggest that the point was hafted, fixed to a handle or a shaft. A spear with a stone tip is more than a sharper stick. It changes what kind of animals you can hunt safely. It allows you to stand a little farther away from a dangerous body of muscle and bone. Thrown spears and later lighter projectiles extend reach even more. With a hafted scraper, you can grip farther from the cutting edge and apply more controlled force, scraping hides cleaner and faster without shredding your hands. To make a composite tool work, you have to know several things at once. Which woods are straight and strong enough for shafts, which plants exude sticky resins and how to heat them so they become glue instead of brittle crystals, how to twist fibres into cordage, how to keep tension while you bind, how to shape the stone so it sits snugly without splitting the wood. None of that is obvious the first time you try. These are skills that live in bodies and gestures, how it feels when the strike is right, how the resin smells when it's hot enough, how tight the binding should be before it snaps. For those patterns to persist across generations, people had to be watching each other closely, correcting, imitating, and remembering. When archaeologists sort tools from different sites, they start to see something else emerge: regional character. In one area, points might tend to be long and narrow, with fine, delicate retouch. In another, they're shorter and broader, or made using slightly different preparation techniques. Some valleys favour particular scraper shapes. Others develop characteristic backed pieces, tools with one edge blunted for holding, and the other kept razor sharp. Over time, these patterns can endure for thousands of years. That endurance suggests more than just, this is the easiest way to do it. It points toward tradition. A young napper doesn't just learn how to make a cutting edge. They learn how to make a cutting edge the way their people do it. The local recipe for turning stone into function becomes part of identity, even if no one ever says it out loud. These regional styles probably map, at least in a loose way, onto social landscapes. Clusters of sites with similar tools may represent bands and larger networks that shared marriage partners, hunting knowledge, and stories. When a piece of stone turns up hundreds of kilometres from its source, shaped in a way that matches the faraway quarry style, it hints at travel, exchange, or visiting kin. Through all of this, the pace of change is revealing. Some tool traditions appear, spread, and then vanish from the record. Others linger with only small adjustments for staggering spans of time. There are stretches where innovation seems to slow, and others where new forms pile on top of each other quickly. All of it together paints a picture of human groups trying things, copying what works, and sometimes holding on to older ways because they still fit their world. But stone, for all its usefulness, is also a limit. You can hold a flake in your hand and read the angles of force, the order of blows, the outline of a tradition. What you can't read directly is what the maker called the tool, or whether the technique was wrapped in a story about an ancestor or a spirit. You can't tell if certain styles were reserved for particular clans, or if a carefully shaped point was a gift from a grandparent. You can't hear the words that pass between teacher and learner as the first flakes flew. Language, identity, beliefs, all of those leave only indirect fingerprints in the archaeological record. Standardization hints at teaching. Regional variation hints at group boundaries. Sudden bursts of new technology hint at moments when minds, and maybe myths, were shifting. But the inner worlds of the people who struck those stones remain mostly in shadow. Still, if you follow the trail of tools through the Middle Stone Age and Middle Paleolithic, a pattern becomes hard to ignore. Bit by bit, people are getting better at bending materials to their will, imagining sequences of action, and building skills that outlast any one lifetime. The tools are becoming more than just ways to cut meat or shape wood. They're becoming carriers of memory, and as those stone edges refine, another kind of technology is taking shape alongside them. One made not of rock and wood, but of heat, light, and the chemistry of flame. Fire is older than our species, but for a long time it was probably something you borrowed from the world rather than something you made on demand. A lightning strike sets a tree ablaze. A grass fire runs through a dry valley. Early humans and their relatives may have followed those burns, nursing glowing coals, feeding them with dry bark and twigs, keeping the flame alive as long as they could. Losing it would mean going back to the mercy of storms and chance. By the time the stone traditions you've just heard about were flourishing, people were doing something more confident. They were treating fire not as an accident, but as a tool. In caves and open-air sites across Africa, Europe and Asia, archaeologists find patches of reddened earth and stone, charcoal caught in ancient sediments, layers of ash built up over time. In some places, these traces form discrete hearths, repeated fire spots in roughly the same location, used again and again over years or even centuries. Those are the fingerprints of controlled flame. They don't look like much when they're first uncovered. A darker smear of soil, bones with one side burned and the other still white, rocks cracked by heat. In older layers, the evidence is even more fragile. Wind and water scatter ash. Plant roots chew through sediment. Whole campsites can be erased by a single flood or the slow crumbling of a cave roof. That's one reason our picture of ancient fire use is still patchy. We suspect its importance far exceeds the number of hearths we've actually found. Preservation is fickle. 100,000 campfires might vanish without a trace. A handful survive as thin, charred shadows in the ground. But those few are enough to suggest something about how fire wove itself into daily life. Imagine the shape of a day without artificial light. Dawn brings the cool grey of early morning, then the brighter, harsher light of full sun. Work fits itself into that window. People wake, stir embers into flame, warm themselves, perhaps roast leftover scraps from the previous night's meal. Then they scatter. Some go to check traps or familiar feeding grounds. Others fan out to gather plants, insects, shellfish, firewood. Children tag along or stay with older relatives. Tools are carried, used, set aside, resharpened on the spot. The sun moves steadily overhead, tracking the hours in a way you can't ignore. As the light begins to soften again, the direction of movement reverses. People drift back toward a shared centre, drawn not just by habit, but by the promise of warmth, food, and company. There, at that centre, is the fire. It's easy to focus on the obvious benefits. Fire is heat, especially when the air turns cold or wet. A good bed of coals can turn a marginal cave or a drafty rock shelter into a livable home. In colder regions where nights bite and winters stretch for months, the ability to build and maintain hearths is almost certainly what allowed human groups to push farther poleward, or to stay in one camp for a longer season instead of constantly retreating to milder refuges. Fire is also safety. Many predators dislike flame. A ring of firelight and smoke may not have been an impenetrable wall, but it was likely a powerful deterrent. For a species that sleeps on the ground, in bodies without claws or thick fur, that little buffer of heat and light would have meant fewer surprises in the night. Then there is the chemistry. Even simple roasting changes food. Raw meat can be tough, stringy, resistant to chewing. Heat unravels proteins, melts fat, softens connective tissue. Plants that are fibrous and hard to digest when fresh may become more palatable and less risky when baked or boiled. Tubers and roots, especially, can hide both calories and mild toxins. Cooking doesn't magically make everything safe, but it often breaks down at least some harmful compounds and makes starches easier for the body to access. Anthropologists and biologists debate just how deeply cooking transformed our evolution. Some argue that an earlier mastery of fire and cooked food freed up energy, allowing our guts to shrink and our brains to grow. Others see the change as more gradual, one factor among many. What most agree on is that a cooked meal tends to deliver more usable calories per bite, with less time spent chewing and less wear on teeth. That matters in a world where every calorie counts. A day's gathering might yield tough roots, small animals, bones with marrow, seeds. Raw, these are resource-intensive to consume. Cooked, they become more like efficient fuel. Fire lets you squeeze more energy from the same landscape, which in turn makes harsher environments survivable and lean seasons less deadly. But if you stop the story there, fire is just another technology, an especially dramatic one, but still basically a tool. Its deeper role shows up when the practical work of the day winds down, and the darkness thickens at the edges of the light. Because once the evening tasks are done, once the meat is roasted, the tubers baked, the embers raked into a sustaining glow, the fire becomes something else entirely. It becomes a stage. Around the hearth, people repair tools, resharpening points by the glow of coals, softening resins to rehaft blades, mending bindings. They twist fibres into cordage, scrape and stretch hides, carve bone or wood with small careful motions. The flicker of light is fragile, but it's enough to keep hands busy for another hour or two. This is likely when much of the teaching happens. A child stands close, watching how an adult holds the stone and the hammer, how they angle the flake. Someone guides small hands on a scraper, correcting their grip. Questions are asked. Why this wood and not that? Where did you find that sticky sap? Which plant will make you sick if you don't cook it long enough? The answers might be simple instructions, or they might come wrapped in stories, myths about how a certain animal taught humans to use fire, or warnings tied to tales of people who ignored the rules and were punished. Language practiced by day in the urgency of the hunt and the search for food becomes slower and more expansive at night. Around the fire, you can talk about things that aren't immediately in front of you, places far away, seasons long past, ancestors who died years ago, spirits, or forces that no one has seen but everyone discusses. You can rehearse what happened in the last hunt, argue gently about what to try next time, imagine strategies that haven't yet been tested. The fire stretches the human day not just in time, but in mental space. It gives you hours that are not entirely about staying alive in the present moment, hours that can be spent weaving memory, planning, speculation, and play together. Song, rhythm, and eventually something like formal storytelling all find a natural home here, in this ring of intermittent light where faces glow and the rest of the world fades into darkness. Every hearth we find in the archaeological record once held these intangible things as surely as it held burning wood. We can sift its ash and identify the species of trees that were burned. We can examine charred bones and determine whether they belong to deer or horse, antelope or fish. In some cases, we can even see how many times a fire spot was reused and rebuilt. What we can't recover are the sentences that rose into the smoke. We don't know what jokes made people laugh until they coughed with it. We don't know the first metaphors someone used to explain lightning, or why the moon changes shape. We don't know how a grandparent told the story of the time the river iced over early, or the way a parent explained where babies come from, or where the dead go. We only know that some kind of explaining, some kind of remembering, must have been happening again and again, night after night, for tens of thousands of years. When you sit by a campfire today, staring into the coals and letting your thoughts wander, you're sharing in a very old rhythm. The pattern of day and night your distant ancestors knew wasn't broken by streetlights or glowing screens. It was a simpler alternation, bright, exposed, and busy under the sun, gathered, reflective, and storied around the flame. Fire made new foods possible. It opened colder lands, it protected sleeping bodies, but it also gave human groups a shared, recurring space in which time slowed down and words could take root. Those words, carried in voices and memories, were as fragile as smoke. Most of them vanished as soon as they were spoken. Yet out of that endless flow of talk around evening fires, a few ideas stuck about who we are, where our people came from, how the world works and what it means. The hearth in that sense was more than a circle of warmth. It was a quiet engine, turning heat and light into culture. And when the last fuel was pushed in, the last embers banked for morning, and people lay down in the cooling dark, the glow would fade, leaving only the faint smell of ash and the memory of words. Above them, the sky was as black and wide as ever. Ahead of them, another day of work and searching. But between those two, between the long bright labour and the longer dream-filled night, there was always that small island of firelit time, where minds could stretch just a little beyond survival. In that flickering margin, the path toward everything that would follow, art, religion, science, cities, was already beginning to glow. By the time the evening fire is burning steadily, the hardest work of the day is already done. Somewhere, not too far away, the land has been combed. If you could follow your ancestors through one of those days, the first thing you'd notice is how little of it looks like the simple picture in school books. A heroic hunter with a big spear, chasing some enormous animal. Most of the time, the work of staying alive is quieter, more patient and more varied than that. The menu starts small. In the soft light of morning, people move out into familiar territory, a slope that, at this time of year, carries certain berries, a stand of trees where nuts fall heavily in the late dry season, a seep where edible greens appear after the first rains, a strip of coastline where shellfish can be pried off rocks at low tide. Every landscape has its own list, and the list changes with the seasons. Tubers lie underground in hidden nets of root. Some are mild and starchy. Others are laced with irritants or outright poisons unless they're treated carefully. Leaves can be boiled and the water thrown away. Pieces can be sliced thin and roasted until the smell changes and the sting fades. Nuts carry dense calories in tight shells. Some crack easily between stones. Others need to be dried first or leached in running water to wash out bitter compounds. Seeds can be ground on flat rocks, mixed with a little moisture, warmed on stones near the fire until they puff and brown. Honey glows at the edge of the possible. It's one of the richest foods in the ancient world, but it comes guarded by insects that sting, or hidden in crevices that require climbing, smoke, and courage. In some traditional societies today, honey gathering is almost an art form, knowing which trees to check, what season, what the bees' flight patterns mean. It's likely that for many of your ancestors too, honey was both delicacy and prize, something people sang about on the way home. Shellfish and other shoreline foods tell another story. On coasts and along big lakes and rivers, people learn the tides and the currents the way others learn animal tracks. They know when mussels are fat, which patches of reeds hide fish, how to wade quietly at dawn with a spear or basket. Some shellfish accumulate toxins at certain times of year. Learning when to avoid them is a matter not of instinct, but of accumulated memory. All of this makes foraging look less like random wandering and more like reading. To live this way, you have to hold a mental map of your home range, where everything grows, when it ripens, how long it keeps, what it looks like at different stages. You have to remember which plants are cousins, similar in appearance, different in effect. You have to know how to process the tricky ones safely, how to store the fragile ones, how to combine them with other foods so that a thin stew still delivers enough protein, enough fat, enough micronutrients. It's a knowledge-intensive way of life. Even the animals are part of that map. Small game, birds, hares, rodents, reptiles, fish, provide a steadier trickle of meat than the dramatic big hunts. People set snares in narrow animal paths, drop weighted nooses from overhanging branches, weave fish traps that funnel movement toward narrow exits. Children can learn to flush out lizards, to catch frogs or insects, to throw stones with deadly accuracy. Big animals are different. They demand coordination. In open grasslands, groups may fan out and slowly push herds toward a ravine or a hidden bog. At the right moment, a sudden rush, shouts, thrown spears. In forested regions, hunters might move in quiet arcs, reading every snapped twig, every faint scent on the wind. In snowy landscapes, they may track animals over long distances, using endurance rather than speed, following a wounded creature until sheer exhaustion makes it vulnerable. Sometimes the kill comes from close range, with a thrusting spear delivered at great risk. Later people develop lighter projectiles, spears thrown with the aid of a spear thrower, darts that can be launched from a safer distance, eventually bows and arrows in some regions. But even with better tools, the essential ingredient is cooperation. Someone has to spot. Someone has to decide when to advance, when to hold back, when to abandon a trail that's turning dangerous. In some groups, certain people specialize, not because anyone has a permanent job the way they might in a settled village, but because skill and preference sort themselves out across the band. One person reads tracks unusually well. Another has a knack for predicting an animal's next move. Another is known for patience, able to sit motionless for hours at a game trail. Elsewhere, where large animals are scarce or unpredictable, people lean into what archaeologists call broad-spectrum strategies. Instead of focusing mostly on a few big prey species, they widen the net. More small animals, more fish, more shellfish, more seeds and roots, more opportunistic harvesting of whatever the landscape offers. Over thousands of years, in some places, you can see this broadening in the record. Shell middens, piles of discarded shells, grow thick along coasts. Bone assemblages shift to include more small animals and fish. Grinding stones become more common, worn smooth by years of seed processing. It's not agriculture yet. Nobody's planting fields or herding domestic animals on purpose. But it's a hint that people are learning to squeeze calories from a wider range of sources, experimenting with new ways of living within their environments. Underneath all this variety is a simple, brutal fact. On any given day, some people will be luckier than others. One group might come back from the shoreline with baskets heavy and dripping. Another returns from the hills with only a few handfuls of bitter greens. A hunting party may spend hours tracking an animal, only to lose it in dense terrain, while another stumbles almost accidentally into a successful ambush. Food sharing is the human answer to this unevenness. In many foraging societies studied today, meat from a large animal does not belong just to the hunter who struck the final blow. It's divided according to rules everyone knows, moving outward from the core family to more distant relatives, to neighbours, sometimes even to visitors. Plant foods, too, are shared, maybe less dramatically, but often no less systematically. This isn't just kindness, it's a form of insurance. If you give today when you are lucky, you have a strong claim to receive when you are not. Over time, the entire group smooths out the sharp peaks and valleys of daily fortune. Children whose parents had a bad run of luck still eat because other families had a good day. Elders who can no longer hunt or dig tubers still get their share. Injured people can heal instead of starving. Sharing also binds people emotionally. Refusing to give, or hoarding too much, can damage reputations, strain alliances, and in a small group that depends on each member, that's dangerous. Generosity, by contrast, builds credit that is social as well as nutritional. Those quiet exchanges of roasted meat, cracked nuts, cooked roots, passed hand to hand around the fire, are one of the ways a band becomes a we, instead of just a cluster of individuals. When you step back, the picture of hunter-gatherers that emerges is very different from the old stereotype of people living on the edge of starvation, wandering aimlessly. Foraging societies, past and present, tend to be remarkably flexible. They can shift emphasis from big game to fish, from roots to nuts, from coastal foods to inland ones, depending on how the climate swings and what the land provides. They innovate, inventing new traps, new processing methods, new ways of storing surplus when a particular resource comes in abundance. They adjust group size and movement patterns as conditions change, splitting into smaller units in lean times, gathering into larger ones when food is plentiful and social ties need refreshing. This, more than anything, is the secret of food before farming. Not a single signature dish, but an adaptable relationship to the living world. Every day, minds move across the land, matching memory to season, observation to action. Every evening the results are pooled, shared, argued over, woven into stories. What worked this year? What failed last time? Where the tubers were thickest after the last big flood? Which kind of shellfish tasted off in the hot months? Long before fields, long before barns, this is how your ancestors ate. By turning attention, cooperation and creativity into calories again and again for tens of thousands of years. And when their bellies were full enough and the fire was burning low, they turned those same skills toward another task, deciding where and how to sleep. If you went looking for their homes with modern eyes, you might think they had none. Cities leave skylines, villages leave foundations, even early farmers leave post holes and ditches you can trace like ghost floor plans. For most of the last 150,000 years, people left almost nothing so obvious behind. Part of the reason is simple. What they built with doesn't last. Wood, grass, reeds, branches, hides, piles of brush and light poles. On an archaeological timescale, these are smoke. They rot, burn, get trampled into the soil, carried away by animals, washed out by floods. A storm can erase a season's worth of construction in a single afternoon. The ground itself is shifting under them. Riverbanks migrate, sand dunes creep, coastlines drown and reappear as the ice sheets advance and retreat. A camp that felt solid and familiar in one generation can be under a lake, or buried beneath meters of silt a few thousand years later. So when we go looking for houses, what we mostly find are traces. A ring of darker soil where a windbreak once stood, marked by the stains of former posts. A crescent of stones, set deliberately to hold down the edges of a hide shelter. A scatter of burned bone and charcoal where a hearth was used again and again. Layers of compacted earth that tell us quietly that feet slept and sat and worked here, not just for a night but for years on and off. Many camps, especially in mobile groups, were probably very simple. A few poles leaned together, a hide slung over the top, an opening turned away from the prevailing wind. In forested regions, maybe brush piled to make a low wall, with woven branches on top. In colder places, snow and turf stacked as insulation. In dry seasons, perhaps nothing above you at all, just the shelter of trees and a shared agreement about where the sleeping places would be. Rock shelters, overhanging cliffs, shallow caves, offered something sturdier. Across Africa, Europe and Asia, archaeologists find these natural refuges peppered with thin, dark bands in the sediment. Each band is a living floor, ash, tiny fragments of bone, stone chips, bits of ochre, sometimes traces of pollen from plants brought in as bedding. In some sites there are dozens of such layers, stacked one atop another like the pages of a book, telling us that people kept coming back to the same recess in the rock, year after year, century after century. In open country, the evidence is even fainter, but it's there. At some sites, magnetically altered soil and charcoal flecks map out clusters of small hearths, arranged in patterns that repeat. You can see in the distribution of stone flakes where people sat to make tools, all of them facing the same direction, perhaps looking out over a valley. Refuse accumulates in specific zones, off to one side, downhill, downwind. Food was eaten here, butchered there. Sleeping areas tend to be cleaner, with fewer sharp flakes, fewer gnawed bones. None of that looks like a house in the modern sense, but it does look like something just as important: planning. To separate a napping spot from a sleeping spot is to think ahead about comfort and safety. To put rubbish in one area and keep the hearth circles clear is to manage smoke, smell, and pests. Even in very temporary camps, this kind of micro-organisation shows up again and again. It suggests that home, for your ancestors, was less a building and more a pattern in space, a way of arranging life around fire, around tools, around each other. Within that pattern, there were quiet revolutions in comfort. Bedding isn't glamorous, but it might be one of the oldest quality of life technologies humans developed. In South African rock shelters more than 100,000 years old, archaeologists have found mats of compacted plant material laid over the floor, layer upon layer, sometimes dusted with ash, possibly to keep insects away. Elsewhere, there are traces of grasses, leaves and twigs that seem to have been gathered deliberately, renewed when they became dirty or damp. Over and above this plant layer, hides make another kind of improvement. A skin thrown over bedding keeps drafts off. Folded double, it cushions hip and shoulder. Rolled, it becomes a portable mattress and blanket in one, easy to carry when the group moves on. In colder climates, multiple hides, hair in, hair out, trap warm air. Children are wrapped and unwrapped. Elders can rest more comfortably. People heal faster from injuries when they can stay warm and dry. Insulation can be as simple as piling extra brush on the windward side of camp, or stacking rocks into low walls that block the worst of a prevailing gale. In some regions, people may have lined shallow pits with grasses and skins, essentially making dugout sleeping nests that hold heat better than the open air. These tricks leave almost no visible signature after enough time has passed. But where we do see depressions, concentrations of plant remains, or repeated ash layers, they hint at a surprisingly deliberate technology of rest. How long any of these homes lasted depended on how people moved. For many groups, life followed what anthropologists call seasonal rounds. In dry seasons, camps cluster near permanent water, taking advantage of fish, riverine plants, and the animals that come to drink. In wet seasons, people may move higher, away from floods and biting insects, exploiting different plants and game. Certain spots, especially rock shelters, good vantage hills, springs that rarely fail, become base camps, used for weeks or months, then left, then revisited when conditions swing back around. From these base camps, smaller hunting and gathering parties set out on shorter trips. A good berry patch might earn a one-night stop marked only by a tiny hearth and a few footprints in the soil. A promising herd might pull a group out onto the plain for several days, sleeping under the open sky, using the simplest possible windbreaks or none at all. These brief way stations barely touch the earth. Archaeologists may never see them. Because of this, the map we can reconstruct is always partial. Where the ground was kind, where rock overhangs preserved ash and debris, where chance protected a patch of ancient floor from erosion, we catch glimpses of intimate spaces, hearth rings repeatedly relit in the same spot, napping areas returning like constellations, faint sleeping platforms rebuilt over older ones. In harsher landscapes, or older layers, the same kinds of home may have existed and simply vanished without trace. So when we say we don't see houses in deep prehistory, we have to be careful. The absence of neat post holes or stone walls doesn't mean your ancestors slept in chaos or had no sense of belonging to particular places. It means that what counted as home was often light on the land, flexible, quickly made and quickly unmade, following the rhythms of animals, plants and water. Home was a circle around the fire, a shared understanding of where to cook, where to work stone, where to lay children down at night. It could be picked up and carried, then quietly reassembled in a new clearing, under a new stand of trees, beneath a familiar cliff face stained with smoke from fires long gone. From these modest, vanishing structures, another industry grew, the one your ancestors wore on their backs, stitched, scraped and softened to turn exposure into shelter you could carry with you. Clothing is even more invisible than houses. A shelter might stain the soil, leave a ring of stones, a patch of ash. A shirt, a pair of leggings, a hood or a glove made from skin or fibre, those just disappear. They rot. They're eaten. They crumble into nothing long before the layers of earth above them turn to rock. For most of the last 150,000 years, your ancestors' wardrobes have vanished without a trace. So when we talk about what they wore, we're mostly not talking about direct finds. We're talking about clues. One line of evidence is simple logic. If people were living in windy uplands, or spending winters in Ice Age Europe, or hunting far out onto frozen rivers, bare skin wouldn't be enough. Even a body with a thick layer of fat can't stand for hours in sub-zero wind chill without some kind of insulation. The very fact that humans occupied those environments at all suggests they had learned to carry shelter on their skin. Another clue hides in bones. Not human bones, but animal bones. At many sites, archaeologists find piles of carefully butchered skins animals, reindeer, horses, antelope, big bovids, cut in ways that preserve long, continuous stretches of hide. There are telltale scrapes on the inner surfaces, where flesh and fat were peeled away. The pattern of cuts often makes no sense if the goal is just meat. It makes much more sense if someone was trying to save the coat. Then there are the tools. Across Africa, Europe and Asia, from at least 100,000 years ago and probably earlier, people are making specialised scrapers, stone tools shaped just right to be drawn again and again across a wet hide, removing tissue, thinning and softening the skin. The edges of these tools carry microscopic wear that matches experimental hide working. Their distribution at sites, clustered near hearths and away from butchery debris, suggests dedicated tanning spots, places where someone sat for hours working a single skin into something usable. This process is slow. An animal is killed. The hide is peeled off, stretched, pegged or weighted. Flesh is scraped away, often with repeated passes. The skin is soaked, twisted, maybe rubbed with fat or brain tissue to lubricate the fibres. It's smoked over a smouldering fire to make it more resistant to water and decay. All of this can take days. Hide working is one of the earliest crafts that demands patience, knowledge and practice. Do it wrong, and the result is a stiff board that cracks when you fold it. Do it well and you get something soft, flexible, almost cloth-like, a material you can sleep on, wrap around a child or shape into clothing. Shaping it is another puzzle. We rarely find needles from this deep in time, but we do start to see bone points, slender, polished, sometimes with a groove or tiny indentation at one end that could have served as perforators or primitive awls. With an awl, you can punch holes along the edge of a hide and then thread something through. That something is another invisible revolution. Cord. The moment your ancestors learned to twist plant fibres, tendons or strips of rawhide into cordage, the world changed. A single string can tie a shelter together, snare a small animal, fasten a bundle to a carrying frame, or lace two edges of leather into a tube that fits around an arm or leg. Fibres almost never survive from this period, but their ghosts are everywhere. grooves on antler and bone that look like they've been used to smooth strands, wear marks on stone that match the friction of twisting, tiny notches on spear points where bindings once held stone to wood, and in some rare miracle sites, waterlogged bogs, dry caves, actual fragments of cord and woven material show up much later, confirming that the skills must have deeper roots. Once you can make cord, you can also make nets. Imagine a net hung in a stream, catching fish that drift in overnight, or stretched between stakes on a small game trail, turning a single hunter into a wall of many hands. Nets help gather fruit from high branches, carry loads of shellfish from the shore, support sleeping babies as hammocks. None of that leaves much of a trace 10,000 years later, let alone 100,000. But the efficiency of net hunting, the convenience of slings and bags, is so great that it's hard to imagine people not experimenting with them wherever suitable fibres were available. In cold climates, these invisible technologies, hides, cords, sewn or laced garments, are almost certainly what opened the door to whole continents. Fur next to the skin, windproof leather on the outside, cords binding sleeves and leggings closed at wrists and ankles. That combination traps a layer of warm air against the body. Add soft shoes or moccasins with grass or fur inside, and suddenly a barefoot tropical primate can walk and work on snow for hours. Archaeologists and geneticists have tried to pin down when truly tailored clothing, garments cut and shaped to the body, with sleeves, hoods, and multiple components, first appears. One hint comes from an unusual source: lice. The DNA of clothing lice, which live in garments rather than on skin, suggests they split from head lice sometime tens of thousands of years ago, probably when humans started wearing layers that stayed on their bodies day and night. But even that only gives a rough window, and it doesn't tell us what those early outfits looked like. A poncho-like wrap, a cloak pinned with a bone spike, trousers for riding, or just leggings tied to a belt. Here, we move from evidence into careful speculation. What we can say is that clothing is never just warmth. Making a garment is work. The person who knows how to choose the right skin, how to thin it to the right thickness, how to cut around the tough parts, how to join pieces without creating chafing seams, that person holds valuable knowledge. It has to be taught, often over years, by watching and doing. Children scraping practice hides beside their elders, learning to feel with their fingers when the thickness is right, memorizing patterns that no one has bothered to draw. Within a band, the styles of cutting and stitching become a kind of quiet signature. The way a seam curves over a shoulder, the particular knot used to secure a tie, the choice to leave fur on in one spot and shave it off in another, all of these can say "ours" to the people who know what they're looking at. Colour creeps in too. We know from residues on grinding stones and fragments of stained shell that people were using ochres and other pigments very early. Those pigments don't only go on skin. They can be rubbed into leather, painted onto bags, dabbed along the fringe of a cloak. A red-tinted hood, a blackened pair of hunting leggings, a bag with a band of yellow along the edge. These are ways of marking identity, signalling role, perhaps even indicating achievements or life events. In this way, clothing becomes a moving canvas of social information. Who did the stitching on that beautifully finished baby wrap? Who has a hood lined with particularly fine fur, or a pair of gloves that fit almost perfectly? Such items can be gifts, inheritances, reasons for quiet pride. They can also be practical test of trust. Good clothes keep you alive. To share them is to share safety. None of this shows up clearly in the soil. For archaeologists, the deep prehistory of clothing is mostly a silence, broken by a few tools, a few wear patterns, a trail of indirect signs. But if you picture your ancestors at the fire, laughing, working, leaning into the light. It's almost impossible to see them as naked figures, untouched by fabric or skin. More likely, you would see a shifting mosaic of cloaks and wraps, belts and pouches, cords holding back hair, soft boots drying by the coals. You would see knowledge stitched into every seam, and survival hanging from every shoulder. Around that same fire, those skills and styles were doing something else just as important. Binding people to one another. Teaching a teenager to scrape a hide is teaching them to care for the group. Pleating cord beside a grandparent is a lesson in patience and attention. Learning the right way to tie a knot is learning in a small tactile way what it means to belong. From here, it's a short step to another layer of human life that doesn't fossilize easily either. The web of relationships, obligations, and shared stories that held those bands together night after night as they wrapped themselves in their handmade shelters and slept. If you could sit quietly at the edge of one of those fires and watch, the first thing you'd notice is how many different ages are packed into that small circle of light. Human groups, for most of the last 150,000 years, were probably small. Maybe a couple of dozen people, sometimes fewer, sometimes a few more. A handful of families travelling together or staying near a favoured river bend as long as the food held out. But family here doesn't mean a neat little nuclear unit like in a modern house. It's messier, looser, more tangled. A child might sleep beside a mother one night, curl up against an aunt the next, trail after an older cousin all morning while the adults work. An old man might not be anyone's biological grandfather, but still be grandfather to half the camp. Bonds grow through shared food, shared work, shared danger, not just through blood. Anthropologists often talk about bands, flexible groups whose membership can shift. Someone marries in from a neighbouring community, someone quarrels and goes to stay with distant kin for a season. Two bands that have travelled separately for months might merge for a while when the game is plentiful, splitting apart again when the land starts to feel crowded. That fluidity is a kind of insurance. If a drought ruins the hunting ground, you have somewhere to go. If a dispute becomes too bitter to solve, people can quietly drift apart instead of killing each other. In a world without courts or police, the ability to leave is one of the strongest conflict resolution tools there is. Underneath that shifting surface, though, are thicker roots, a wider network of related bands spread across the landscape. People probably knew who their distant cousins were. They knew which direction to travel to find a finds, in-laws, who owed them hospitality. They knew the names of people they'd never met but had heard about around the fire. Into this web of relationships, human children arrive astonishingly helpless. A newborn ape can cling to its mother's fur and haul itself along within hours. Human babies can't even hold up their heads, and they stay dependent for years. They need help walking, feeding, carrying, protecting, teaching. That long, vulnerable childhood is risky. It only works if lots of people cooperate. Mothers are almost never raising children alone in this kind of world. Older siblings, aunts and uncles, cousins, and especially grandparents probably play huge roles. A grandmother who can't hunt fast anymore can still rock a baby, collect easy firewood, tell stories that keep restless toddlers from wandering into the dark. Some researchers argue that this grandmother effect is one reason humans evolve long post-reproductive lifespans. An older adult who lives on after their own children are grown can still boost the survival of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Their investment pays off in the arithmetic of evolution. From the child's point of view, this means there are many safe laps to crawl into, many hands to learn from. You might watch a girl carrying her baby brother, learning balance and patience as she walks. You might see a boy shadowing a skilled hunter, not allowed to throw yet, but memorizing every move. You might hear an elder humming the same tune each evening, weaving lessons into rhythm and repetition long before anyone ever writes anything down. Cooperation doesn't end with childcare. It extends into almost every task that keeps the band alive. Hunting large animals is rarely a solo sport. People have to move together, coordinate, read each other's intentions. Some might drive animals toward a hidden line of spears, others wait in ambush. Success depends on trust. No one breaks early, no one steals the best cuts and runs. Even gathering can be collective. A group moves across a hillside, chatting softly, eyes scanning for berries, roots, seeds. Someone calls out when they find a patch. Others join in, helping strip the plants before birds or other animals arrive. The haul is carried back to camp where hands sort, clean and cook. The evidence we have from bones and sites suggests that when food comes back, it's usually shared. It's unlikely that anyone who regularly refused to share would stay welcome for long. In a small band, reputation is everything. People remember who helps when meat is scarce, who looks after a neighbour's child, who pretends not to see when someone limps back to camp empty-handed. Care for the injured may have been surprisingly deep. Skeletons from various times and places show people who survive for years with serious disabilities. Healed fractures, damaged limbs, conditions that would have made independent hunting almost impossible. For them to live that long, someone had to feed them, carry loads for them, adjust the pace of travel. There may have been grumbling. No prehistoric group was a utopia. But over and over, the pattern hints at a basic truth. Small human bands often chose to carry their weaker members rather than abandon them. How do you keep such intense cooperation from collapsing under the weight of resentment and rivalry? One answer is leadership, but not leadership as a fixed throne. In many small-scale societies studied in recent times, influence tends to be situational. The best tracker leads the hunt. The person with the deepest memory of the landscape chooses the seasonal route. The calmest negotiator speaks during a tense meeting with strangers. When the crisis passes, those people go back to being ordinary members of the group. There may be individuals who are consistently respected, whose voices carry more weight. But power is fragile. Overbearing, selfish behaviour can be met with criticism, mockery, or in extreme cases, quiet exile. In a world where almost everyone can in principle walk away, lasting domination is hard to maintain. Another answer is norms, shared expectations about how people ought to behave. These norms don't appear as written laws. They live in stories about greedy hunters who come to bad ends, in songs praising generosity, in the way a camp falls silent when someone crosses an invisible line. A child learns them not as abstract rules, but as felt reactions on the faces around them: approval, disappointment, laughter. Reciprocity is one of the strongest of these unwritten rules. If I share with you today, there is an expectation, not always spoken, that one day when I'm sick or unlucky, you'll share with me. Not immediately, not counted out in equal portions, but over seasons and years. This long memory of favours given and received weaves the band together. Sometimes reciprocity stretches beyond the immediate camp. A person might travel to another band's fire carrying gifts, meat, shells, a fine tool, and return weeks later with different goods, different news. Underneath the exchange are old agreements. Your people helped my grandmother's people during a bad winter. My uncle married your aunt. Our children will need each other someday. All of this is guesswork, informed by modern hunter-gatherers and the sparse hints left in ancient sites. Not every band was peaceful. Not every relationship was kind. Different environments likely produced different social patterns. Tighter groups where resources were scarce. Looser networks where food was plentiful. But whatever the local variation, the general picture seems clear. For humans to survive 150,000 years before cities, they had to become experts not just at hunting and hide-working and fire-making, but at living together. at raising slow-growing children in groups where everyone knew everyone else, at balancing rivalry with obligation, autonomy with belonging. Those invisible skills in cooperation would shape what came next. The routes they took across continents, the strangers they met, the bargains they struck, and eventually the first faint outlines of larger societies beginning to form beyond the horizon of the little band's fire. When a band decided to move, it wasn't because someone unfolded a map of the world and pointed to Europe or Australia. It was because the berries on the familiar hillside were ripening later each year, because a river that used to swell with fish after the rains now ran shallow, because someone's uncle had come back from a long visit with in-laws, talking about a valley 2 weeks' walk away where the herds were thick and the winters a little kinder. Most movements were short, following the seasons up and down a slope, shifting along coastline as shellfish beds recovered, circling back to a good campsite year after year. Over generations, though, these small decisions added up to something huge. Instead of one heroic march out of Africa, genetic evidence suggests many pulses of expansion and retreat. Groups spread north, then were pushed back by colder, drier phases. Others moved east along greener belts, then stalled when deserts expanded. Some waves may have left no descendants at all, their lines ending quietly in some forgotten valley. Climate opened and closed doors. In wetter periods, grasslands stretched like highways across what is now the Sahara, dotted with lakes and rivers. In those green Sahara windows, people and animals could move fairly easily between what we now call West Africa, East Africa, and the Mediterranean fringe. Later, as aridity returned, those routes narrowed or vanished, stranding populations in new regions, isolating some, forcing others to find different paths. Along coasts, there was another kind of road. As sea levels rose and fell with the ice ages, shorelines crept far out and then back again. Wide coastal plains, now drowned, may once have been rich with shellfish, seabirds, and plant foods. Some researchers think early Homo sapiens hugged these shifting edges, travelling around the Arabian Peninsula, along the shores of the Indian Ocean, perhaps all the way to Southeast Asia in a series of small steps. Inland there were corridors, valleys with dependable rivers, mountain foothills where streams and forests offered predictable resources. Bands might follow migrating herds through these passages, learn the bends and landmarks so well that a child could one day guide her own children along the same route by memory alone. From the inside, these journeys were not grand migrations. They were practical choices made by people who did not know they were heading toward Europe or Australia, only that the sky looked wrong this year, that the familiar waterhole had sunk too low, that a trusted elder dreamed of plentiful game in the direction of the setting sun. With movement came encounters. By the time bands of Homo sapiens had spread into the Middle East and beyond, the world was already inhabited by other humans, Neanderthals in much of Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans and their kin across large parts of Asia, perhaps other lineages we barely glimpse in the genetic record. Archaeology gives us scraps, stone tools of different styles layered in the same cave sediments suggesting one group occupying a place after another. Sometimes their tools overlap in time, hinting that they might have used the same shelter in alternating seasons, or even shared the landscape at once. Genetics adds another layer. When researchers sequence the DNA of living people, especially outside Africa, they find small percentages that don't match typical Homo sapiens ancestry. A sliver looks Neanderthal. Another sliver in some Asian and Oceanian populations looks Denisovan. These fragments tell us that meeting was not just seeing smoke on the horizon. It sometimes meant bodies and lineages blending, children with mixed ancestry, born into bands that had to find ways to make sense of difference. We shouldn't imagine constant harmony or constant war. The truth was likely a patchwork. In one valley, two bands might eye each other from a distance, wary, keeping to opposite sides of a river, occasionally trading a glance or a shout and nothing more. In another, a small party of travellers stumbles on strangers at a waterhole. Hands tighten on spears, voices rise, someone throws the first stone, or someone laughs, steps forward, offers a piece of meat or a brightly coloured shell. Admixture in the genes tells us that sometimes, at least, the meeting went beyond a single tense afternoon. Individuals crossed whatever boundaries existed, through capture, through arranged exchanges of marriage partners, through secret liaisons during joint hunts, or shared winters in the same cave. Over time, some of those children lived long enough to have children of their own. Their genetic traces are still with us. But genes can't tell us what it felt like. Imagine walking for days through unfamiliar country, following directions pieced together from half-remembered stories. The land is strange. The plants smell different. The stars seem shifted. Then, one evening, you see another fire. The silhouettes around it are human, but not quite like the people you grew up with. Maybe they're stockier, with different faces. Maybe they speak in sounds you don't recognise. Yet you can see the shapes of their tools, the way they tend their fire, the pattern in which they sit, elders, children, adults ringed around flame. You know, instantly, that they are people. Do you approach? Do you circle wide and slip away in the dark? Do you wait until morning and watch from hiding, trying to decide if the risk is worth the chance of new information, new mates, new allies? Those decisions, made again and again in countless places, shaped the human story. Sometimes bands fled, choosing safety over contact. Sometimes they fought, and one group drove the other away or wiped them out. Sometimes they made space for each other, dividing the landscape into hunting grounds by custom and memory. Sometimes they folded together, slowly, through small acts of trust and curiosity. Behind every arrow of migration on a modern map are people weighing hunger against fear, hope against caution, a leader listening carefully to an old woman who remembers a pass through the mountains, a hunter tracing the tracks of an unfamiliar prey, realizing it moves differently than the animals back home, a young person restless at the edge of the firelight, dreaming of what might lie beyond the next ridge. Over tens of thousands of years, those choices carried our ancestors along rivers and seashores, across deserts when the brief wet phases allowed, over mountain passes and down into new valleys already held by other hands. They did not know they were filling a planet. They were simply looking for enough water, enough game, enough space to raise children without constant hunger. In that search, they kept meeting strangers who were not quite strangers, other humans, different yet recognisably the same. From those uneasy, fragile meetings came new genes, new ideas, and the tangled, mixed ancestry that all of us inherit today. When that first contact didn't end in running or blood, something else could begin. Exchange. Not trade in the way we picture it now, with markets and prices and arguments over value, but a quieter, older kind of give and take. Things moved from hand to hand. A sharp flake of stone, a length of sinew, a bundle of dried meat, a scrap of information about where the herds had gone this year. Archaeologists see only the shadows of this. At a campsite high in a mountain valley, they find obsidian. Volcanic glass so sharp it can slice flesh like a razor. The problem is, there's no volcano for hundreds of kilometres in any direction. In a cave far from the sea, they find shells that clearly once belonged to marine snails, drilled or worn, polished by handling. Deep inland, in a cliff shelter among dry hills, they find crumbs of red ochre, the iron-rich pigment used to stain skin, tools, and perhaps ritual objects, whose chemical signature says it came from a deposit far away. Stone, shells, and colour do not walk by themselves. Something, or someone, carried them. That someone might have been a band on the move, bringing familiar materials along as they shifted their range. It might have been a single adventurous person who wandered too far and never returned, their belongings left behind in a place their home band never knew. Or it might have been a chain of hands. This band meets that band at Waterhole, passes on a few prized items, which then travel with the recipients to the next meeting and the next. Over thousands of years, these small movements add up to astonishing distances. Obsidian from one quarry has been found spread over hundreds of kilometres. Shells from ancient shorelines turn up deep in continental interiors. Traces of particular ochre sources appear in sites spread across regions that would take weeks to walk. These patterns hint at networks, not paved roads or permanent caravans, but a web of paths and relationships along which things and ideas could flow. In a world where the climate kept shifting the rules, this web wasn't just convenient, it was insurance. You can imagine the logic, even if we can't reconstruct the exact words. You meet a neighbouring band at a river crossing your grandparents used to talk about. The last time your people passed through, the salmon run was strong. This year, it is weaker. You've seen signs of drought to the south. The other band has news from farther north. They say the berries there are late but thick. The winter was hard, but the herds are rebounding. Maybe you offer them a bundle of dried meat in gratitude for the information. Maybe you gift a stone point made from a kind of rock they've never seen, purple and glossy, from a far-off hill your band visits once every few years. They respond with a shell pendant from the coast, or a piece of ochre from a cliff streaked with red that lies beyond your usual rounds. On the surface, this might look like simple swapping of goods. Underneath, it is something deeper, a testing and strengthening of ties. You are signalling. We are the kind of people who give, the kind who remember, the kind who might welcome your cousin as a marriage partner, or shelter your injured hunter next winter, or share news when the rains fail. Anthropologists who study recent hunter-gatherer societies see versions of this everywhere. Gift-giving is rarely just about the object. It is a thread thrown outward, an invitation to a relationship, a promise, implied, not written, that help might flow along that thread if needed. In the long, unstable Pleistocene, those threads could mean survival. If a drought hit your home valley, it mattered enormously whether there were people 2 weeks' walk away who knew your name, who had eaten your food and laughed at your jokes, who had once accepted a gift from you and given something in return. It mattered whether your young people had married into their band, weaving kinship lines that crossed rivers and ridges. Each person carried a kind of social map in their mind. Not a picture of continents, but a web of memories. The place where your mother's sister went when she married. The band your father once travelled with during a lean year. The group that camped with you one cold season and taught your people a new way to set snares. The relatives of a man you traded spears with long ago. On that map, some names were closer, some farther, some tied to places you had never seen but had heard about in stories told softly around the fire. The map could guide decisions as surely as the stars. If this valley fails us, where can we go? Who might welcome us, at least for a season? Where can we send a daughter who wants to leave, a son who longs to see different hills, in a way that increases, instead of decreases, the chances that our grandchildren will have enough? These questions are part of why exchange mattered so much. Objects were signals. A bead made from a particular shell might show that you had kin near the sea. A distinctive style of stone point might be recognized as belonging to a certain region. Ochre from a far-off source might hint that your band had contact routes stretching beyond the horizon. Innovation rode along these routes too. You don't need cities or huge populations for new ideas to spread. All you need is occasional contact. If one band discovered a better way to shape a spear point, or a clever method for binding stone to wood, or a novel recipe for detoxifying a bitter root. Those techniques could radiate outward every time someone visited in-laws, met strangers at a waterhole, or shared a campsite with another group for a season. A person might return from such a stay with a new song, a new story, and a slightly different way of holding a hammerstone. Within a few generations, that slightly different method might be standard across an entire region, used by people who had never met the original innovator and never heard their name. In this way, culture could move faster than genes, faster even than people. If you're curious to explore these long, quiet networks more deeply, the full story in book form is available at sleepytimehistory.com. And, just for this week, there's a discount for listeners who want to drift off with a longer version of this journey at their bedside. Of course, when we trace these invisible threads through artifacts, we have to be cautious. A piece of obsidian far from its source might mean formal trade between groups who met regularly to exchange goods. It might mean a marriage, one person carrying a favourite knife when they left their birth band to join their partner's people. It might mean capture, someone taken in a raid, their possessions changing hands without any friendly agreement. It might mean simply that a band moved over several generations, dragging its material culture along like a comet's tail. The same shell bead could be a treasured heirloom, a bride wealth gift, a lucky charm lost in the grass, or a token dropped by someone passing through a place for the first and only time. From a distance of tens of thousands of years, all we see is that it is here and that its origin was there. So instead of a single, neat story about trade routes, it may be better to imagine a shifting mesh of contacts, sometimes thick and busy, sometimes thin and frayed, some paths used often, others rarely, some relationships warm and trusting, others edged with competition or fear. Yet, through all that complexity, one pattern keeps emerging. Humans, even in small scattered bands, were not isolated dots on the landscape. They were nodes in a living network, bound together by gifts given and received, by news carried across ridges, by marriages that braided one band's fate to another's. Those invisible threads would grow denser over time. As tools became more specialized and symbols more common, the same network that once carried a few pieces of obsidian and shell would begin to carry something even more powerful: shared meanings, shared songs, shared ways of seeing the world. That is where we turn next. Before there were temples or written scriptures, there was colour. Long before the famous cave paintings of Europe, people in Africa and elsewhere were collecting lumps of red, yellow and black ochre. They ground them, scraped them, rubbed them into powder. At some sites, blocks of ochre are worn smooth along the edges, as if from years of handling. Others are scored with deliberate cross-hatched lines or patterns that don't seem to serve any obvious practical purpose. What did those lines mean? We don't know. They might have been marks of ownership. This is mine. Or this belongs to our band. They might have been early attempts at counting, tallies for kills, seasons or journeys. They might have been the first hints of something more abstract, a sign that stood for a clan, a place, a story. Or they might have been nothing more than idle scratching, the way someone today might doodle shapes while thinking. Even that would be important. It would show a mind comfortable with making marks that are about ideas, not just things. The ochre itself may have carried meaning even without designs. Body-stained red could signal strength, beauty, adulthood, or readiness for a ritual. Certain colours might be reserved for healers or for the dead. Children watching their elders paint each other's skin would learn, wordlessly at first, that colour could mark out who you were and what moment you were in. We see echoes of this in shells and teeth turned into beads. At sites in Africa more than 100,000 years old, archaeologists have found tiny pierced shells, too small to serve as containers or tools, worn smooth at the edges as if they were strung and rubbed against skin or clothing. In later periods across Eurasia and Africa, we find more and more of these. Marine shells, animal teeth, bits of bone, carefully drilled, sometimes covered with pigment. A single bead, on its own, could just be a pretty bauble. A whole string of beads, following a particular pattern, worn in a way recognisably similar from one site to another, begins to look like a message. Maybe certain arrangements signalled, "I am ready to marry," or "I belong to the people of the Northern Valley." Perhaps some patterns marked someone as a skilled hunter, a successful midwife, or a person who had taken part in a dangerous rite. Whatever the exact meanings, beads turned the body into a surface for symbols. When two bands met, they didn't just see strangers. They saw colours, patterns, objects whose styles might be familiar or foreign. In that instant, long before anyone exchanged words, people could begin to sort, like us, not like us, kin, almost kin, complete outsider. This is one way symbols bind groups together. By sharing the same colour schemes, the same types of pendants or engravings, people declare themselves part of a we that stretches beyond the small band they happen to be camping with this season. That we can travel. A particular bead style might spread hundreds of kilometres along the same exchange networks that carried obsidian and shells. Somewhere along those paths, a person might look across a river, see familiar patterns on a stranger's chest and feel a small jolt of recognition. Those are our people, even if we have never met. Engraved lines on bone and stone show the same tendency. We find pieces marked with repeating notches, zigzags, grids and curves. Maybe some were practical, keeping track of lunar cycles, hunting returns or ritual days. Others might have been purely aesthetic, a delight in symmetry and rhythm captured with a stone point. If you hold one of those engraved fragments in your mind's hand, imagine how it would feel as you traced it. Each groove is a memory of motion, a record of a hand that chose to make a mark and then repeat it, exactly or almost exactly, again and again. Repetition is a kind of thinking. It is also a bridge to another art that leaves fewer traces. Music. Every tool strike, every footstep, every heartbeat has its own rhythm. But at some point, humans began to play with rhythm intentionally. By the time of the later Ice Age, we have unmistakable instruments, flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory, with carefully spaced holes. They produce notes you could still recognize today. But the musical impulse is almost certainly far older. A hollow log beaten with sticks, a pair of stones click together, a bundle of shells shaking against a thigh. These require no special materials, only attention. Someone starts a pattern, someone else joins in, matching, then varying, then weaving their own beat around the first. And then there is the oldest instrument of all, the human voice. Even without words, a voice can hum, chant, sigh, and call. Long before anyone sang about heroes or gods, people could have used melodies to soothe infants, coordinate group movements, or pass the time while working. Simple songs might have carried instructions, how to weave a net which plants to gather in forms that were easy to remember and easy to teach. Around a campfire at night, when hunting was over and the dark pressed in close, these sounds would gather people together. One person might begin a low, pulsing rhythm on a drum-like surface. Another might clap softly along. Voices rise and fall, some keeping to the main line, others adding flourishes no one planned in advance. Stories slip in between verses, where the herd was found this season, how the great-grandmother once survived a terrible winter, why a certain star marks the time to move camp. In such moments, art, music, and symbol blur into one experience. Lines scratched into ochre could be explained in song, Beads could be given as part of a story about their journey from the sea. Children watching and listening absorb not only facts about the world, but a sense of belonging to a line of people who remember, who mark, who celebrate. From a distance of tens of thousands of years, we can't hear the songs or decode the patterns with confidence. We see only that, over time, symbols become more common, more standardized, more widely shared. Styles of ornament and engraving fan out across landscapes the way a popular tune might spread today. A distinctive way of painting with ochre, a familiar motif scratched into bone, can show up far from where it originated. Meaning, like obsidian and shells, rides the network. And always, at the centre of these exchanges, there is evening light. Firelight softens faces, makes pigments glow, sends shadows twitching on stone. In that circle, tools put aside, the human imagination has room to wander. Someone idly traces a spiral in the dirt. Someone else hums a fragment of melody their grandmother used to sing. A child asks what the marks on the old bone mean, and an elder perhaps tells a story that connects those marks to ancestors, to places, to events long past. This is not yet art in the museum sense, nor religion in the organised sense. It is something more basic and more mysterious. The urge to mark experience, to share it, to make it last a little longer than a single life. In that urge lie the seeds of everything that would come later. From these early colours and patterns and sounds, the path leads, slowly, toward images of animals leaping from cave walls, toward myths and rituals, toward ideas of spirits and powers that cannot be seen but must be reckoned with. To follow that path, we have to step from the world of marks and melodies into the world of the dead. The dead are some of the best teachers we have, not because they meant to be, but because they stay where they are put. Bones, teeth, shallow depressions in the earth, all of these last far longer than spoken words. When archaeologists talk about the earliest religion, they almost always end up talking about burials. But if we go slowly and carefully, what those burials really show us first is something simpler and just as profound. Care. Very early in the human story, before clear art, before obvious shrines, we find skeletons that don't look like simple accidents. Bodies laid out in positions that seem deliberate rather than random. Limbs tucked, hands drawn up, heads resting as if on an invisible pillow. In some Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens sites, the pit that holds the body is just a little deeper than you would expect if someone had simply abandoned a corpse. The soil around it sometimes shows a different texture, a sign that it was dug and then refilled. In a few places there are stones placed like markers, or slabs used to cover the grave. Is this proof of belief in an afterlife? Not necessarily. It might simply be hygiene, moving a decaying body away from camp to avoid disease or predators. It might be a practical choice, like clearing space in a rock shelter. But even then, someone lifted that weight. Someone spent time and energy dealing with a body that no longer hunted, gathered, or told stories. That in itself is a kind of meaning. Over time, the burials become more suggestive. We start to see what archaeologists call grave goods, objects placed with the dead that do not seem necessary for disposal. A sharp tool, an animal bone, a shell pendant, sometimes a piece of ochre. In later periods, there are entire sets of items, spears, ornaments, food offerings, carefully arranged. Why bury tools with someone who can no longer use them? Why give a necklace to a person who will never again stand in the sun? One answer is sentiment. The objects may have belonged to the person in life, and burying them could have been a way to say, "These were yours, they go with you." It might have been as simple as not wanting anyone else to wear a dead person's beads or handle their favourite knife. Another answer reaches a little further, into the realm of belief. If people thought that some part of a person continued after death, shadow, breath, name, memory, then those goods might have been provisions for a journey, signposts of identity, or gifts to whatever lay beyond. A body dusted with red ochre might be symbolically made new, reborn in colour, or marked as special in some way. We can't know for sure. We only see that, again and again, the dead are not treated like trash. The same careful attention appears in another kind of evidence, lives that lasted longer than they had any right to. There are skeletons of Neanderthals and early modern humans whose teeth are worn down, whose bones show long-healed injuries, whose joints are shaped by years of arthritis. Some individuals had crippling deformities from childhood. Others had broken limbs that had mended in ways that would have made walking or hunting almost impossible. Yet they survived for years. An individual with a badly healed leg bone had to be carried, or at least supported. Someone would have had to bring food and water when they couldn't move. A toothless elder unable to chew tough meat likely depended on others to soften or pre-process food. This is measurable compassion. In a world without hospitals or pensions, feeding and protecting someone who could no longer contribute much to hunting or gathering is a real cost. The group pays that cost anyway. That suggests emotional bonds strong enough to override strict efficiency. Parents, friends, partners, elders. These roles meant something beyond immediate usefulness. When such a person finally died, grief would not be a modern invention. Tears, quiet periods, the urge to talk to the absent as if they were still listening. These are near universal human responses today. It is hard to imagine that our Pleistocene ancestors, already capable of complex speech and symbolic thought, felt nothing when a loved one's sleeping place was suddenly empty. In that emotional landscape, the idea of an unseen world finds fertile ground. A body is present, warmth fades, breath stops. The person who laughed, argued, sang, the one you still see in the shape of that face, is suddenly not there in the way they were. Where did that something go? Different bands, different species might have answered that question in different ways. Maybe they thought the dead lingered near waterholes or certain trees. Maybe they believed that dreams were visits from those who'd gone ahead. Maybe an odd sound in the night, a flash of light, a run of good or bad luck was interpreted as the work of invisible companions. From hints in much later hunter-gatherer societies, some researchers suggest that early shamans, or shaman-like figures, may have already existed in these deep times. People who were particularly skilled at entering altered states, through drumming, dancing, fasting or plants, might have been seen as travellers between the everyday world and some other layer of reality. It's possible that such people led funerary rites, spoke to the dead on behalf of the living, or helped the living interpret strange experiences as messages. But here, more than anywhere, we are walking on thin ice. Bones do not tell us who chanted, or what they saw behind closed eyes. What we can say is that certain patterns line up. Burials with special treatment, pigment dusted over bodies, objects placed and arranged, evidence of long-term care for the weak and the old. All of these together make a picture in which the dead matter, in which they remain social beings whose fate must be managed, whose memory must be tended. At the same time, we have to be wary of projecting full-blown religions backwards. A neat grave does not automatically mean belief in heaven and hell. A few shells near a skeleton do not guarantee a fully formed mythology, priesthood, or moral code. Many of the practices we see could be rooted in habit, in tradition for its own sake, in the simple desire to do what our people have always done when someone dies. And yet even that continuity is striking. To do something the same way, generation after generation, is to treat it as important. Children watching a burial learn that death is not chaos. There is a pattern. The body is placed here. The ochre is used like this. The beads go there. The people stand or sit in a certain way. Words are said. or silence is kept. Ritual, even in its simplest form, creates a bridge between the visible and the invisible. You cannot see grief, but you can see what people do with their hands when they grieve. You cannot see an ancestor, but you can see the place where their bones lie, the stone that marks it, the path your feet take each time you visit. In the long view, the specifics of belief shift and blur. Spirits, gods, ancestors, forces of nature. The labels change, the stories multiply. But under all of that lies something we can recognize across the gulf of tens of thousands of years. Love and loss. Those are the currents that carve deep channels in human behavior. They motivate people to carry an injured companion through difficult terrain, to share scarce food with someone who can never repay them, to spend precious time digging into hard ground to make a resting place. Stone tools chip and scatter, art crumbles, shell beads break, but graves and healed bones keep whispering the same core truth. Long before there were temples or holy books, humans were already making room in their lives for the dead and for the feelings the dead leave behind. Those feelings, of connection to someone no longer present, are not the end of the story. They are the beginning of a new one. Because once you live in a world where the most important parts of a person can be absent yet somehow still felt, you are only a step away from imagining other unseen forces as well. For most of the story we've been telling, the idea of staying in one place on purpose would have sounded odd. If you're a skilled forager in a rich landscape, moving is not a burden, it's a strategy. You follow ripening seasons the way we follow calendar months. You know where the berries will be sweet in early summer, where the shellfish will be safe after the storms, where the herds tend to pass when the first frosts arrive. Your map is not a flat picture. It is a schedule written in memory. In that kind of world, agriculture, in the later, full sense, ploughed fields, permanent houses, rows of domesticated plants, was not an obvious upgrade. It was a huge risk. A mobile band that knows its territory well can ride out local failures. If nuts don't set well in one valley, you walk to another. If game becomes scarce in one region, you tap into kin networks somewhere else. Diversity is your insurance policy. You eat dozens and maybe hundreds of different species over a year. Diseases that wipe out a single plant hardly touch you. Early farming flips that logic. You clear land, you burn brush, cut trees, build fences. You invest months of labour into a few species of plant that all share similar vulnerabilities. A freak frost, a swarm of insects, an unexpected drought, and an entire year's food can disappear. It's not surprising that when anthropologists compare early farmers to neighbouring foragers, the results are mixed. In many regions, the first farmers are shorter, have more signs of nutritional stress, more dental disease from increased starch. They work harder, for longer hours, to squeeze calories from the earth. So why did anyone make that switch? The answer is that they didn't, all at once, and not in the way we often imagine. Before fields came something quieter, intensification. Imagine your band returning to the same valley again and again over the years, because it is especially good. The wild stands of grain there are thicker, the tubers fatter, the water more reliable. At first you simply harvest what you find, but slowly habits creep in. As you cut seed heads, you shake some out nearby, where the soil is good. You start favouring plants whose seeds shatter less easily, because they're easier to collect. Without any conscious plan, you're already nudging the genetics of those wild plants. You burn the underbrush in a controlled way in early spring, knowing that next season the fresh growth will attract game and encourage certain edible plants. You protect a stand of fruit trees from being overbrowsed by animals, maybe by piling dead wood around the youngest trunks. You dig storage pits into cool soil or rock, lining them with grasses or bark, caching nuts and dried meat for the lean season. None of this feels like farming. It feels like intelligent foraging. But over generations, these small acts reshape the landscape. Archaeologists find traces of this in many places long before full agriculture. Concentrations of wild grains that look unnaturally dense, patterns of burning that repeat in the same groves, grindstones worn smooth by centuries of processing seeds, storage pits redug in the same spots year after year. People are still mobile, but less randomly so. Their movements tighten into circuits around favoured resource zones. Their calendars become more precise. This valley for spring greens, that riverside for summer fish runs, the plateau for autumn nuts, and finally back again to the place where the grains now grow particularly thick. Some researchers call this process resource scheduling. It's like making appointments with the landscape. For as long as populations remain thin and climates fickle, this system can remain remarkably stable. Many later hunter-gatherer societies lived in dense, organised territories for thousands of years without turning to full farming. They managed forests, rivers, coastlines and grasslands with fire, pruning, selective harvest, and social rules about when and how much to take. So something had to push. One push was population. Human numbers rose slowly through most of prehistory, but not evenly. In certain lucky regions, river valleys, fertile uplands, productive coasts, successful foraging, and those networks of trade and marriage we talked about earlier combined to create pockets of relative crowding. Bands that once had vast territories to roam found their neighbours closer, their boundaries more fixed. You can't simply move elsewhere if everywhere is already someone's scheduled hunting ground, someone's sacred grove, someone's ancestral campsite. Another push was climate. After hundreds of thousands of years of violent swings, parts of the world entered a period of relative stability in the last ice age's aftermath. Rain patterns became more predictable in some regions. Growing seasons lengthened slightly. For a species already expert at reading patterns, this was an invitation. If you can count on the rains coming at roughly the same time each year, the advantages of planting ahead, of weeding a bit, of protecting young plants from animals start to outweigh the risks. If you know your winter will be cold but not wildly different from the last 10, you can invest in bigger storage, heavier structures, more children. Those earlier themes, tools, networks, symbols, tie into this shift as well. Standardized tools and shared techniques meant that once one group discovered a more efficient way to harvest and process seeds, the idea could travel far faster than genes. A better sickle edge here, a new grinding method there, and suddenly large-scale grain use becomes feasible. Trade networks meant you could buffer bad years by calling on distant partners, making it safer to commit to more local intensive strategies. Symbolic systems, stories, taboos, rituals could encode complex rules about land use, who may cut wood where, when burning's allowed, which groves are off limits because ancestors are said to dwell there. In this way, belief and practice braided together to manage landscapes long before law codes and boundary stones. Importantly, this did not happen in one birthplace, with a single invention of agriculture that then swept the world like a sudden fashion. The archaeological record shows multiple centres of plant and animal domestication. Wheat and barley in parts of the Near East, millet and rice in different parts of Asia, sorghum and yams in Africa, squash and maize in the Americas, and many more. Each region had its own timeline, its own mix of wild species, its own balance of pressures and opportunities. In some places, people committed deeply to farming. In others, they blended cultivation with continued foraging for thousands of years. There were starts and stops, successes and collapses, experiments that left few traces and others that transformed entire continents. From our vantage point, looking back through the fog of time, civilization can seem like a sharp break. Before, small wandering bands. After, cities and kings. But when we smooth out the noise, the line looks much more like a slow slope. The habits that made settled life possible, long-distance cooperation, careful observation of plants and animals, the ability to store food, the use of symbols to organize behavior, the emotional glue of family and memory and shared ritual, are as old as our species, and in some ways older. Villages, fields, walls, and written laws were not a brand new way of being human. They were one particular arrangement of very ancient pieces, another branch on the tree grown from roots sunk deep into the dark soil of those 150,000 years before cities, when people already knew how to read the seasons, share their burdens, and imagine futures they would never personally see. So where does that leave us if we take one last step back from the diagrams and dates and think about what it actually felt like to be human in all that deep time before cities? Across continents and ice ages, the details changed endlessly. Different animals, different plants, different skies. But certain patterns show up again and again, as reliably as the phases of the moon. Fire, first of all. For at least hundreds of thousands of years, people ended their days by a controlled piece of lightning. A little captured star they could move, feed and share. It warmed sore muscles and drying hides. It turned tough roots sweet and safe. It kept some predators at a distance and drew others, humans, closer, gathering bodies into small circles of flickering light. Tools, too. From rough stone flakes to elegant blades, from digging sticks to finely shaped bone needles, daily life was a conversation between hands and materials. You woke knowing that your survival depended on edges you could trust, bindings that would hold, containers that would not leak when the rain surprised you. The work was constant, but it built a quiet confidence. You could shape the world just a little to meet you halfway. Then there was cooperation. No one survived alone for long. The basic unit was rarely the individual in the modern sense. It was the band, the web of kin and long-standing companions who knew your childhood scars and your favourite stories. Food moved through that web, meat from a lucky hunt, nuts from a good grove, roots dug by careful hands, as naturally as breath. So did information. A new trick for carrying embers, a dangerous plant to avoid, a distant group worth visiting again. Movement tied it together. Almost everywhere, life meant walking. Not frantic flight, but seasonal, thoughtful motion. Valleys and ridges, rivers and coasts became familiar not from maps but from repetition. Feet and memory traced the same paths again and again, and over generations those paths connected to others, until the whole planet slowly filled with routes known by heart. Migrations, meetings, partings, returns. These were as much a part of the human condition as hunger and sleep. And running through it all were symbols. Not at first in carved monuments or written scripts, but in songs, gestures, shared rituals, marks on rock, arrangements of objects in graves, ways of saying, this matters, this place, this ancestor, this story about how the world began, or why you should never fish in that pool in late summer, meaning layered over landscape, until even a plain hillside could be crowded with invisible significance. These are the pieces we're most confident about, because they leave traces we can see. Hearths, tools, bones, residues of pigments, patterns in genes. But a great deal remains in shadow. We do not know the exact words people used to comfort a frightened child 10,000 generations ago. We do not know the melodies that rose over a camp on the night before a dangerous hunt, or the full shape of the stories told about animals that are now long extinct. We can only glimpse them, dimly, through fragments. New discoveries change the picture all the time. A cave floor scraped a little more carefully reveals a footprint. A bit of DNA preserved in sediment redraws a migration route. A redated site pushes back the origin of some skill we thought was recent. The long night before cities is not a fixed painting. It is more like a slowly developing photograph, details sharpening as more light is added. But even with all that uncertainty, a final scene suggests itself. Imagine the end of a day, somewhere on an ancient plain, or in a forest clearing, or on a pebbled beach above the tide. The air has cooled, the sun has gone. Overhead the sky is a bright river of stars untouched by walls or smoke or street lamps. A small fire burns low, more embers than flame. Around it sit perhaps 20 people, elders with lined faces, adults loosening their shoulders after a long day, children fighting sleep. They have eaten. Bellies are not full the way we would define it, but satisfied enough for tonight. A few tools lie nearby, half finished. Someone turns a piece of stone in their hands, testing its balance. Someone else hums under their breath. A baby stirs, then sinks back into breathing that matches the crackle of the coals. Beyond the circle of light, the land is vast and dark and alive. Insects call. A distant animal moves through brush. Farther still, other fires burn, unseen but imagined, where other bands sit under the same stars, telling different versions of the same very old story. Who we are, where we came from, how we should live. There are no cities, no clocks, no written laws, but the essential human things are all here already. Warmth shared, dangers remembered, tools laid ready for tomorrow, minds wandering out beyond the horizon and backward into the past. When you eventually close your eyes tonight, you're not doing something new. You're joining a chain of sleepers that runs back through all those forgotten camps. The world you wake into may be paved and wired and loud, but somewhere, buried deep in your body and your culture, the long night before civilization is still present. If you found this journey into that darkness calming or interesting, you can help more people discover it. Gently tap like, if you haven't yet. If you'd like more slow dives into deep time and quiet history, you can subscribe and let the next story find you when you're ready to drift off again. I'd also love to hear where you're listening from. A city apartment, a countryside bedroom, a long train ride, a ship at sea. Leave a comment and add your dot to this very modern, very global campfire. And if your curiosity is still awake behind your closing eyes, there's a book waiting for you. It's all about these prehistoric secrets, the hidden lives behind the artifacts and bones. You can read more about it and pick up a copy if you like at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, though, the fire is low. The stories are finished. Let the long night stretch out as it has for so many thousands of years and rest.